Well, thank you. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm proud to stand alongside two very good friends of mine and colleagues, Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and Representative Annie Kuster, the chair of the New Democrat Coalition. The three of us are proud to announce, along with nearly 200 of our House Democratic colleagues, we are releasing a letter calling on Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans to end their threat of default. Now, before I go into the specifics, I want to address one thing. Republicans like to claim they are being fiscally responsible. But let's be clear. There never has been and never will be anything fiscally responsible about refusing to pay America's bills. Killing millions of jobs is not fiscally responsible. Neither is knowingly unleashing a recession. So we Democrats stand united across the ideological spectrum of our caucus, from some of the most progressive members to some of the most moderate members and everything in between, to stand up and say, let us actually do our work, let us actually do the responsible thing, and ensure that we pay our bills. It is rather interesting. I can't help but observe that one of the best ways you can tell that there is a Democrat in the White House is Republicans suddenly start talking about the deficit and debt. They forget about this issue, mind you, whenever there's a Republican in the White House. There's George W. Bush, Donald Trump. They had no problem raising the debt ceiling. You didn't hear a peep out of them about this issue. But anytime there's a Democrat in the White House, they go off on this gambit, no matter how many previous times it has failed for them. Just recently, when Donald Trump was president, Congress voted 3 times to raise the debt ceiling. Twice under Congressional Republican control, and once under Congressional Democratic control. Those 3 increases in the debt ceiling included 0 spending cuts. And Republicans had no problem whatsoever voting for them. So what they are doing today on the House floor with their DOA Act, the Default on America Act, fortunately that bill will be DOA, and I'm quite confident not signed into law. That doesn't get us any closer to resolving this situation. The X date, the date by which America must absolutely pay its bills, is drawing closer. In fact, perhaps even closer than was originally thought in January. So it's time once and for all for Speaker Kevin McCarthy to end this reckless brinksmanship. Join with us, as he has in the past, the recent past. Fulfill our obligation, as America has for 247 years. Let us ensure that we pay America's bills. There is too much riding on failure. And with that, I am happy to bring up my good friend, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Representative Boyle. We're so proud to have you as our ranking member of the Budget Committee. Representative Kuster, it's so wonderful to be here with you as chair of the New Democratic Coalition and with colleagues from across the ideological spectrum who have signed this letter, and to say that Democrats stand united. We are here because by refusing to pass a clean debt ceiling, Speaker McCarthy has thrown a grenade that threatens the American economy, the global economy, and we are here to demand that Speaker McCarthy put the pin back in the grenade, that he remember his constitutional duty and allow America to put a clean bill on the floor to lift the debt ceiling. The Default on America Act that would cause a recession, would threaten jobs, hurt seniors, veterans, and working and poor people across America is DOA for the American people. If the United States defaults, I just want to go into the consequences of this a little bit so that people understand out there what the Republicans are doing. It could plunge America into a recession. 7 million people could lose their jobs. Seniors and people with disabilities could miss Social Security payments that they desperately need. Small businesses wouldn't get their loans. Families wouldn't be able to get child care because child care workers wouldn't be able to get paid. Veterans would be robbed of health care. Interest rates would skyrocket. It would lead to higher credit card bills for the average American family who is trying to pay off those credit cards or pay their mortgage payments. And it's estimated that families would lose at least $10 trillion in household wealth and their retirement accounts. So I just want to be clear, as Ranking Member Boyle said, that Republicans have suddenly decided that they have a problem with raising the debt ceiling under a Democratic president, but they didn't have those problems when Donald Trump was president. In fact, they turned around at that point and raised the deficit by $2 trillion with their 2017 tax scam that gave 80% of the benefits to the top 1%. Now, Speaker McCarthy wants to destroy the economic security of working families. And the chaos of the extreme MAGA Republicans will spread chaos to every single one of our homes across the country if they have their way. Working people are still being squeezed by the cost of living. They should not be forced to pay for the consequences of MAGA extremists using their own pocketbook. Conversations about government spending have a time and place during the annual appropriation cycle. That's what we do during the appropriation cycle. That's fair game. And we welcome Republicans trying to negotiate during the regular budget process, just as parties have every year. But let's just remember for a second why they haven't gotten these demands through before. Because they are so extreme, cruel, and unworkable that not even moderate Republicans will vote for them. Who wants to tell their constituents that they kicked 1.7 million women and children off of nutrition assistance? Who wants to tell their constituents that 600,000 people are going to lose their health care, or that seniors are not going to get their Social Security and Medicare payments, or people with disabilities are not going to get their Medicaid? It's cruel, it's extreme, it's unworkable, it's hostage-taking of the American people to pass an agenda that they could not pass through the regular budget process. And that's why we as Democrats are united today across the ideological spectrum in solid opposition to this extreme Republican agenda, which brings us to our next speaker and our co-lead on this letter, New Democrats Chair Annie Kuster.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Pramila. Good morning, everyone. As you can see, across the House Democratic Caucus, we are united in calling on House Republican leadership to stop playing games with our nation's debt and to join Democrats in passing a clean debt ceiling increase. Defaulting on our nation's debt would be catastrophic, not only for our economy, but for global financial markets and for millions of Americans whose Social Security and Medicare benefits would be impacted. As you've heard, a default would mean jobs would simply disappear, retirement savings would evaporate, housing costs would rise, veterans would lose access to critical care, and everyday costs will go up. And let me explain to you in my district in New Hampshire, in the 2nd District. Homeowners could see the cost of their monthly mortgage payments go up by $200. We already have very high housing costs in New Hampshire. 7,200 jobs could be lost. Over 96,000 households would be at risk of losing their Social Security check. And this isn't unique to my district. This will happen across this country in Democratic and Republican districts alike. We cannot let that happen. Thanks to Democrats' leadership under President Biden, our economy continues to recover and grow stronger following the twin economic and COVID-19 crises. In fact, President Biden and Democrats have already cut our deficit by historic levels when we passed and he signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act. And the president's budget that he has proposed will reduce the deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. That's deficit reduction. On the other hand, Republicans claim that their proposal will reduce the deficit, but in reality, the policies in the GOP plan will actually add to the deficit and the debt. For example, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office previously projected that rescinding parts of the Inflation Reduction Act will actually increase the deficit by $114 billion. The GOP plan would also slash $30 billion from funding for our veterans, meaning that fewer healthcare visits, longer wait times, and more uncertainty for those who protected us and served our nation. We cannot allow Republicans to throw away all the progress that we made under Democratic leadership by defaulting on our nation's debt. As members of Congress, it's our responsibility. We take an oath to defend and protect the full faith and credit of the United States. We all stand here today, representing every corner of our caucus, united behind instituting a clean debt ceiling increase. In addition to discussions about a clean debt ceiling increase, New Dems are willing and eager to discuss our nation's fiscal responsibility in the long term. We must reduce the deficit and make bipartisan reforms to ensure our economic strength and resilience for generations to come. But those two conversations are separate. That's why this Congress, New Dems, have formed an economic growth and fiscal responsibility policy task force to explore long and short-term fiscally responsible solutions. We can do both. Prevent a default on our debt now, and then have bipartisan discussions about advancing smart fiscal policies that set our economy and our country up for success. We hope that Republicans will abandon their extreme and reckless approach and join Democrats in moving forward to strengthen our economy. And now I'll turn it back to Representative Boyle for questions.
Thank you, Annie. And if anyone has any questions, I saw Matt's hand. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I didn't know there's an order. Matt getting me in trouble.
Totally fine. So if Speaker McCarthy manages to pass this today, what's next step for Democrats? I mean, does it make sense with the X date probably maybe being a lot earlier than expected? Does it make sense to continue just expecting Republicans to swallow a clean debt hike, or is it time to start actually, talking with Republicans about what to do? And what do you think Democrats should do?
Yeah, first I have to say I reject the premise that somehow we are not talking or refusing to talk. There has been this sort of false notion that has gotten out there. I thought that actually both of the co-chairs here addressed that quite effectively. We are happy to have a discussion and a debate and come to an agreement about what future spending looks like. We do that every year. Suppose the debt ceiling, suppose that the timing was different and the debt ceiling wasn't, we weren't reaching the X date for another year. We would have to have a debate and an agreement about future spending anyway by midnight September 30th. That is the budget process. That is going to happen regardless of what happens on the debt ceiling, and Kevin McCarthy and the House Republicans know it. So let's really set the record on this and dispel with any false notions. We will, regardless of the debt ceiling, have a discussion, debate, and ultimately agreement about what next year's budget looks like, and perhaps even parameters for future years. What we will not do is give up anything beyond that just in order to get America to pay its bills. We acted completely responsibly when there was a Republican president in the White House. It's time for our counterparts on the other side to do the same, even though the party of the occupant of the White House has changed.
That's good.
Okay, next. I will now.
Sorry, that was my bad. I'll go over to Matt.
Wow.
During the McCarthy speaker, whatever that thing was at the start of the year, Matt Gaetz told me that anything McCarthy did would showcase the power of the Freedom Caucus that they extracted back then. What do we see in this negotiation about the power the Freedom Caucus has on McCarthy and this Congress?
Well, I can't help but observe it took the other side 15 votes just to elect their own guy speaker. So there does seem to be a little bit of internal division on the other side, which frankly is not helpful when it comes to such a serious issue as this. Now, since January, they have obviously been able to pass some pieces of legislation, although I would point out none of those pieces of legislation that have passed are kind of any of them are the major part of their agenda on which they ran. Ultimately, though, when you have seen, and I'm just going to speak about the past examples of debt ceiling increases, you have seen bipartisan votes, and rather big bipartisan votes. So I wouldn't be surprised if one were to see that again.
Well, I would just say, looking at yesterday's discussion in the Rules Committee that went until 2 in the morning, clearly they realized that the concessions they made during the speaker debate to put a certain number of people that represent the extreme MAGA right part of the Republican Party on the Rules Committee had consequences, because they said they weren't going to negotiate, and ultimately they made the bill even more cruel and extreme and unworkable. Now, he may get the votes to pass it on the floor, but that doesn't address the fundamental issue of whether they want to govern. And when the Republican Party has been taken over by these extremists, the prospect of being a governing party goes down. And that's, at the end of the day, are they going to push us to a default? Are they going to shut down the government? Are they going to make America lose full faith and credit of global economies as well? That's the question that's before them. Do they want to govern, or do they want to be an extreme, cruel, unworkable proposition party that doesn't get anywhere and doesn't do anything for the American people?
Did you want to say anything? Okay. I would just finally, I would add what we have seen and we may continue to see is more Republican chaos, crisis, and confusion. Well, I saw you for
I have two, if that's all right, if you'll indulge me. The first one is just you've been very clear, negotiating on spending is appropriate, but not specifically on raising the debt limit. So how do you see this ending then, if that's the position here and you know the position on the other side? My second question was just about the involvement of the White House and at this point, and what level of engagement you think is appropriate, what you're seeing from the White House on spending talks anyway.
Well, so on the second question, I was literally one of the first members of Congress to endorse Joe Biden 4 years ago. I have already endorsed his reelection. I am close to this White House. I was proud to welcome President Biden to my district in Philadelphia on March 9th when he unveiled the White House budget for next year. I have been personally, I'm only speaking for myself, I've been in close contact with this White House. I would point out again the remarkable unity when it comes to our position, not just across the wide ideological spectrum of the House Democratic Caucus, but also working with the White House as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I certainly would say the same for New Dems. I think for Progressive Caucus, we've been in very close contact with them. And I think what we're projecting today is this unity, the same unity that went through 15 rounds of the speaker race. And now we're 213. There's not a single yes vote in our caucus for this proposal that is cruel and unworkable. And the other thing about it, back to your original question over here, we call it default on America. It's DOA when it reaches the Senate as well. So I think that's what Mr. McCarthy has to contend with, is we have a divided government right now, and Democrats are united in our approach.
I would just add that I think there are Republican senators who also don't want us to default on our debt. So I think in the end, the Republicans in the Senate will also have to help work with the Republicans in the House, because this is not something, otherwise I think the Republicans in the House will throw us into a default. I think on President Biden, one of the things that I've really appreciated is in the last 2 years, under a Democratic Congress, both in the House and a very thin margin in the Senate, obviously, but with his leadership, we were able to show how if you invest in our people, in our economy, in our jobs. It actually drives up revenue. And we always talk about debt and deficit as if they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. There's debt and then there's deficit. And for deficit, there's two sides. There's revenue and there's spending. And this president has shown how if we increase revenue by taxing the wealthiest corporations, the wealthiest individuals who just need to pay their fair share. We're not asking them to do any more. They can make profits, they can have millions, but they should pay their fair share in taxes just like the average working person. This president has shown that you can actually reduce the deficit, you can invest in people and make the economy work for everyone, from the middle out and from the bottom up.
Yes, you.
Thank you. I noticed that in the confessions that the House Republican leadership made overnight, it seems as though they're tightening work requirements, but striking the repeal of the ethanol provisions from the IRA. And so I'm curious, as you look at that dichotomy of none of them voting for the Inflation Reduction Act, but calling for leadership to keep those ethanol provisions in, but tightening work requirements, which seem to be unpopular with the American people. I'm curious to how that played out overnight, if you have any response to that paradox.
Well, I was at the Rules Committee testifying, fortunately, late afternoon and early evening,
Not too early.
and not at 2 o'clock in the at 2 o'clock in the morning. I will say, when it comes to House Republicans, whether they're more moderate or more MAGA Freedom Caucus types, their enthusiasm for beating up on poor people never ceases to amaze me. Yeah. It is absolutely astounding, especially when we're talking about some of their own constituents who will be hurt by what they're doing. I would also point out, because I'm reminded by this with respect to the change they made on ethanol credits, as much as they now cry crocodile tears about deficit and debt, the very first bill they put on the House floor was estimated by CBO to increase the deficit by $114 billion. What did that bill do? It would make it easier for the wealthiest 0.1% to cheat on their taxes. So I think that shows you a lot about where their priorities really lie.
You know, one other thing just on ethanol, and we constantly get accused of subsidies for the poor. You know, we're called socialist for wanting to do Medicare or Social Security. But the reality is the Republicans are fine with subsidies for the wealthiest. That's what the 2017 tax scam was about. And the reality is that they're willing to have those subsidies for the PPP, for example, which, you know, we all supported in a bipartisan way. But somehow when it comes to working people being able to qualify for food stamps, 1.7 million moms and kids that are going to get thrown off of food stamps, suddenly that's a subsidy that's too far. When in fact, even that cut alone wouldn't do nearly as much as reversing the 2017 tax scam. So I think it's just a hypocrisy that you're pointing out.
And the last thing I would point out on this, the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly the transition to a clean energy economy, is very, very popular with consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just note the number of Republicans that have already gone to ribbon cuttings in their district for projects from the Inflation Reduction Act. I think, in fact, some of the most extreme far-right MAGA Republicans have been bragging about the size of the project, and I just note Marjorie Taylor Greene, the size of the projects in their district. And I think you have to call that out when you see it, the hypocrisy of voting on this bill, knowing full well that this bill is dead in arrival. It's not happening in the Senate. These cuts are not happening. And then they'll continue. In fact, you ought to keep track of them this weekend when they go home to other ribbon cuttings.
Do you think that voters will be able to draw that distinction on the when you all are on the campaign trail about them rejecting, them voting no, but then going to these ribbon cuttings? Is that something that you think?
We'll remind the voters.
We'll remind them. Yeah.
The other side's philosophy is vote no, but take the dough.
Yeah.
And it is incumbent upon us in the election upcoming to point that out repeatedly. I mean, ultimately, every election is about one side's statement of the case and pressing that argument versus the other side's statement of the case and pressing that argument. So it is incumbent upon us to constantly point that out. But fortunately, we have the facts on our side.
And I'd just say that the unity in the Democratic caucus from President Biden's past 2 years is about the growth in jobs and the economy and opportunity for our constituency. And so there's just been tremendous growth in jobs. Some of us in my district were down to 2.4% unemployment. Like, we have so many good jobs, jobs with benefits that the American people need, their families need that level of support. And so we feel very confident about our agenda.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're
All
good.
right. Any more?
That's it. We should-
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.